If you've ever wanted Jira to send you emails, let me show you exactly how to set it up. So the first thing we're gonna do is jump over to the project where we want this automation to run. So I'll go to my design board, and this is where I'm gonna create the automation. And you could do this from any project or even the system automations or like the global automations within Jira. So from here, I'll go to my project settings, and I'll go to my automations tab. And this whole process of sending an email is really just using automations internally and natively within Jira. And there's one really cool new feature that they actually introduced that makes sending emails way more powerful that I'll show you in just a moment. So all we need to do is create a brand new rule by clicking the blue button at the top right. And I'll create from scratch in this scenario. And the first thing that I'll do is set up a trigger for my rule. Now, this is essentially going to dictate when and why the email is sent out. So I'll use a very simple example of work item created. So I'll select work item created, and anytime something new shows up on this project, on this design project, I'm going to send an email. This might not be the best use case, but let's say that you have this new work item created and you add some conditions later, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then anytime something is high priority, you can send out an email. For now, I'll just leave it as work item created. And what we'll do next is add a component and select add an action. And I'll search for email. And in here, we're gonna have a couple of options. So email or send email was kind of the legacy option that Atlassian used to use for a very long time. And now there's a new option, which is far more powerful that I recommend using for everybody that's sending an email, which is send customized email. And I would pretty much stick to this one only because I also think that sending email will probably phase out at some point soon. And we actually won't see that option. You'll need to migrate over to the new one. So I highly recommend using this more customized option because you're gonna have more flexibility if you ever need it. And most likely you'll never have to migrate away from it. So we'll click on that. And now we're met with a couple of options. And there's two tabs here to keep in mind. There's the settings tab and the content tab. The settings tab is like what the email is, who it's from, the names, the tos, the froms, all the general like little configurations. Whereas the content is what's actually being sent in the email. And let's go over the settings first to make sure we have everything dialed in correctly. So the email name, and this is just kind of for your own internal reporting needs and for like whatever you need to in terms of seeing this internally when you're setting the automation up. So I'll say work item created email. And you can see that there's a little comment here that says the recipients actually won't see this. So feel free to name this whatever you'd like. The next thing we're going to do is set up recipients. And I'm going to drop this into, let's say, assignee. And the reason I'm going to use assignee is that now that we have a new work item created, anytime that it is created, we have automatic assignees assigned to the work item, and we want an email to go to that individual to let them know there's something new to work on. So we'll set up the assignee, but you could use any smart value here. You could use, reporter, any other preset values when you click the drop down. And feel free to go crazy here and even adding in like specific email addresses if you'd like. Then we have the from, and you could set this up depending on what how your Jira environment is used. This is just the out-of-box email that I have in my demo environment, so I'll leave it as this. And for the most part, this doesn't tend to matter too much. If you did want it a little bit more polished, you might need to add some custom domains. And then we'll add a subject line, and I'll say something very simple like new work item is ready. And I'll just leave it at that. You can also add smart values here as well as anywhere else to add like, let's say an issue key or the summary directly in here. Feel free to go crazy with this part. And then we have a couple of optional settings, including like a from name. And this is kind of just going to show you who it's from. So if I want it to feel a little bit more personal, I might say Josh, for example, and then reply to name. Again, maybe I'll say Josh. And reply to email address, this is whenever somebody responds to it, or if it's coming to you, for example, if you respond to it, it's not going to go to this from email, it's going to go to a different email, which feel free to use kind of whatever you'd like in there, whatever makes most sense for you. If you do expect responses, maybe set this to whatever email you expect the responses to come into. If you don't, you could leave this one blank and as is. So that's pretty much it for our settings configuration. Now we go into our content. And I really like to use the rich text option. I'll show you why in a moment, but you also have plain text and HTML. The only really other option I tend to use here is HTML, and you could throw this in through like ChatGPT or use like an HTML viewer to kind of assemble your email, or if you already have an HTML, you could use that here. But I like to pick rich text because it's so simple to just write something and be done with it. That being said, depending on who you're sending this to, rich text and HTML can have deliverability problems. So if you do use a plain text, you're far less likely to end up in like a spam or a junk folder. That being said, with plain text, you really can't do anything fancy. So keep that in mind. And I like to pick rich text, especially if it's an internal email, more of like a notification, for example. And the reason I like this is because of all these formatting options. So I could go in here and start typing in my email, and I could say like, this is a reminder for ... Please respond or add a comment, for example. Thanks. And now I could go in here and let's say just bold something, italicize, we can underline and strike through and like whatever else that we'd like inside of this email to give us a little bit more flexibility when we're actually sending this. So it's fairly straightforward. We go through kind of like you would with a typical rich text editor or like in a Jira description field. You add in everything you need, and then all you have to do is turn this rule on. And I'll click that turn on rule button at the top. We'll give this rule a name. I like to use the format of trigger and then action. So I will say work item created, and then I will do a little arrow, and then I will say send email. That way it's really easy to track exactly what's happening and why inside of the name rather than jumping directly into the rule or the actual automation to see what's going on. We'll turn this on and we're good to go. So anytime something new is created, let's go ahead and just test this out really quick. This is a test random email, and this is probably going to error out because I do not have an assignee by default on these work items. So you can see here there is no assignee. If I go over to my project or space settings, we'll go to our automations, and then we'll jump in and check our work item created. We could check the audit log, and you'll see that there's an error. Because there is no assignee, I'm assuming that's why. There might be something else. There we go. Yeah, there's no assignee. So if you do run into any errors or you're testing this out, audit log is going to be your best friend. Make sure you click on that, see what's happening, see why it wasn't delivered, and fix those things that showed up. So in this scenario, what I might do, for example, if some work items do have assignees whereas some don't, I will add a condition. And you could really add a condition for anything. And I'll use the example that I talked about a little bit earlier where we talk about the priority. So let's say something comes in as a critical, and I want a notification to go directly to the individual who's assigned to it. In this case, I could filter this to only run when something is critical. And I'll add in one more condition, and this is specifically going to be for assignee. And I'm going to say is not empty. That way we won't run into any more errors in the future because we're borrowing the assignee every time we send an email. So fairly straightforward. All I did was add in my trigger, which is when this actually happens. And feel free to get creative with this. Right now, I'm just using work item created. You could schedule this out to run once a day, once an hour. You could make this run whenever a field changes in particular, whenever a comment is added. Really anything you could do in Jira manually can be a trigger. So feel free to get creative with this. And then we go through and we add our conditions in, which is going to essentially not allow it to run unless the conditions are met. So in this case, unless there's an assignee and unless there is a critical issue, we are not running this automation whatsoever. And then if those two things pass, then we finally send the email. Now I'll go ahead and update this, and I'll make sure to go to my rule details and fix my naming scheme because I want to make sure I'm only identifying and making sure that I'm actually setting up the name correctly. When you have only a few automations, this doesn't really matter, to be honest, but once you have 20, 30, 100, 200,000 automations, good luck figuring out what does what without jumping into each individual automation. So keeping this neat and tidy up front is going to be really, really good. So I'll say, for example, critical work item created, then send an email. That way I have that information up front for me and I know exactly when this gets triggered. So it's really as simple as that. We set up our brand new automation and we have everything running, we have our conditions, and we have everything good to go. And that's pretty much it when it comes to running automations and running specifically emails out of Jira. Couple of things to keep in mind is make sure you're using this customized email option because again, I believe that the other one will get decommissioned and you'll probably need to migrate within the next year or two. And if you start creating a lot of these, it's going to create a lot of a headache for you later when you actually start to move these over. So thanks for watching this video. And honestly, this was kind of just the start to automation. If you want to learn more in depth how to actually use automation, how to put things together like your triggers, your conditions, your branches, and everything else, check out this video next.